The sun had barely risen, casting golden streaks across the sky, when James Sullivan stood at the train station, his uniform crisp, his heart pounding. The distant whistle of the approaching train echoed through the cool morning air, mingling with the rhythmic murmur of farewells and last embraces all around him. But for James, there was only one person who mattered: Eleanor. She stood before him, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears, her hands gripping his dog tags as if they alone could tether him to her. The gentle curls of her auburn hair fluttered in the breeze, framing a face caught between love and the silent agony of impending separation. James cupped her cheeks, his rough fingertips tracing the curve of her jaw, memorizing every inch of the woman he was leaving behind. "I promise you, Ellie," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm within him. "No matter what happens, I will come back to you." Her breath hitched, and she clung to him with desperate strength, as if she could hold time still. "And I will wait," she murmured, her voice a vow etched into the fabric of their love. The train roared into the station, its iron wheels screeching against the tracks, a beast demanding its due. James pulled away reluctantly, pressing one last lingering kiss to Eleanor's forehead before stepping onto the platform. The weight of his duty settled upon his shoulders, yet his heart ached at the sight of her standing there, small and fragile against the backdrop of steam and steel. As the train lurched forward, Eleanor ran alongside it, her hand outstretched. James pressed his palm against the window, their fingers separated by cold glass. And then, as the distance widened, she stopped, her silhouette growing smaller until she was just a memory against the horizon. James closed his eyes, gripping his dog tags, the identical twin to the one Eleanor now wore around her neck. He had promised to return. And no war, no force of fate, would keep him from her. The first letter arrived within a week, its edges slightly crumpled, carrying the scent of ink and longing. Eleanor clutched it to her chest before unfolding the pages, her heart pounding as she read James's words. "My dearest Eleanor. The war is brutal, but my thoughts are with you always. The nights are long, the battles relentless, yet your memory keeps me strong. I count the days until I can hold you again. Please wait for me, my love. No war can keep me from you." His letters became her lifeline. Every word painted a vivid picture of distant lands, endless deserts, rain-drenched trenches, nights filled with the distant echoes of gunfire. He wrote of the men beside him, of courage and fear interwoven in every moment. And always, always, he wrote of his love for her. Eleanor read his letters beneath the candlelight, tracing his handwriting with her fingertips, whispering his words like a sacred prayer. The townspeople pitied her devotion, shaking their heads as they passed by her small cottage. "War changes men," they murmured. "He may never return." But Eleanor refused to believe them. His words were proof. His love was unwavering. Then, the letters became fewer. Weeks passed between them. Then months. She told herself it was the war, that the chaos had made it impossible for him to write. But when the letters stopped altogether, silence became her only companion. She waited by the window, watching for the postman. Days bled into nights, and still, no letter came. The absence of ink on paper became heavier than the weight of war itself. The fear she had buried deep within her heart clawed its way to the surface. Had something happened to him? Was he hurt? Was he? No. She would not allow herself to finish that thought. Instead, she sat beneath the old oak tree where they had once carved their initials, holding his last letter against her heart. She read it again, over and over, the ink now smudged with tears. "Wait for me, my love." And so, she waited. The town whispered. "He's not coming back," they said. They spoke in hushed voices at the market, over fences, in doorways where the scent of fresh bread and morning dew lingered. Some pitied her, others shook their heads, convinced she was lost in a dream that would never become reality. But Eleanor did not waver. Each night, she sat by the window, the flickering candlelight illuminating the worn edges of James's last letter. She read it aloud in the quiet of her room, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words would somehow bridge the impossible distance between them. The seasons changed. Autumn's golden leaves gave way to winter's first snowfall, blanketing the world in silence. Still, she waited. Spring arrived, painting the town in wildflowers, and yet, James did not return. Doubt knocked at the edges of her heart, uninvited and persistent. What if they were right? What if time had swallowed him whole? But she could not believe it. She continued her daily routine, moving through the motions of life, but her heart remained tethered to a distant battlefield, to a man who had promised to return. At night, she traced the grooves of their initials carved into the oak tree, whispering his name into the wind, hoping it would carry her love to him, wherever he was. Hope was a fragile thing, but it was also relentless. And for Eleanor, it was the only thing keeping her world from crumbling into dust. One stormy evening, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters of Eleanor's small cottage. Rain pounded against the roof, drumming in an unrelenting rhythm. As she sat by the dim glow of her oil lamp, lost in thoughts of James, a sudden knock echoed through the room. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. No one visited at this hour. Gathering her shawl tightly around her, she approached the door and slowly unlatched it. Standing before her was a man, his uniform soaked, his face drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. A scar ran along his temple, a silent witness to battles fought and survived. "Miss Eleanor?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the rain. "James saved my life." Her breath caught in her throat. She clutched the doorframe to steady herself. The soldier reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter, its edges worn and dirt-streaked. "He wanted you to have this." Her hands trembled as she took the letter. Even through the faded ink and the creases, she recognized the handwriting. James's words, but unfinished. A sob rose in her chest, a mix of relief and fear. He was alive. But where was he? James had been captured, dragged across enemy lines where survival was less a matter of strength and more a game of endurance. The world believed him dead, and in the darkest moments, when the cold bit into his bones, when hunger gnawed at his resolve, he almost believed it too. But Eleanor's face, vivid in his mind, kept him alive. He had lost count of the days, his captivity marked only by the changing of guards and the rare flickers of light that seeped through the cracks of his cell. He listened to the world outside gunfire, shouted orders, the occasional sound of boots crunching over gravel. He waited, biding his time, never allowing despair to claim him. He had promised Eleanor. And James Sullivan was a man who kept his promises. Then, an opportunity arose. A weak link in the chain of his imprisonment, one inattentive guard, one moment of hesitation. James struck with all the strength he had left, stealing through the shadows like a ghost, navigating a landscape that had long since turned against him. He traveled by night, slipping through enemy lines, scavenging for scraps, drinking from rain-filled craters. He followed the stars, each step a battle against exhaustion. His uniform had become little more than tattered rags, his body a map of bruises and old wounds, but his spirit remained unbroken. One night, weakened by fever, he collapsed beneath the shelter of a ruined barn. He would have died there had it not been for a group of villagers who found him at dawn. They spoke a language he barely understood, but kindness needed no translation. They fed him, tended his wounds, whispered prayers over his battered body. And when he had regained enough strength to move, they pointed him toward the border, toward home. The journey stretched on, testing his endurance, his will. But through the hardships, through the endless miles, Eleanor's voice whispered in his mind. "Wait for me, my love." The thought of her waiting beneath the old oak tree, reading his last letter under the flickering candlelight, gave him the strength to push forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, James crossed into friendly territory. The sight of his country's flag brought him to his knees. He was found by soldiers, barely conscious, clutching the dog tags that mirrored the one Eleanor wore. They took him in, fed him, clothed him, and marveled at the miracle of his return. But James did not feel triumphant. Not yet. Not until he stood before the woman he had promised to return to. Years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, a lone figure emerged at the town's edge. The golden hues of fall wrapped the world in warmth, but his breath still came out in wisps of cold. His once dark hair was streaked with silver, his face weathered by time and hardship, but his eyes, those deep, unwavering blue eyes, held the same fire they always had. Eleanor stood in her garden, her hands dusted with earth, the years having softened her youthful features into something gentler, wiser. The weight of time rested on her shoulders, but when she turned, when she saw him standing there, the world around her ceased to exist. For a moment, neither of them moved. The years between them, the war, the silence, the waiting, it all collapsed in that single heartbeat. James took a step forward, his voice hoarse from the miles he had walked, the battles he had fought. "Ellie!" She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as if she didn't dare believe. But her heart knew. It had always known. With a sob, she ran to him, her feet stumbling over the fallen leaves, her arms reaching before she even reached him. And then, after all the waiting, after all the prayers whispered into the night, she was in his embrace. His arms, strong despite the years, wrapped around her, pulling her close, anchoring him to the only place he had ever truly belonged. "I told you I'd come back," he murmured into her hair, his voice breaking. Eleanor clung to him, her tears soaking into his coat. "And I waited." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, two souls finally home. James stood before her, breathless. The years had carved lines upon his face, his body bore the weight of battles fought and lost, but the love in his heart remained untouched. Eleanor reached for him as if afraid he might vanish, her trembling fingers grazing the rough fabric of his coat. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, spilling over as she clutched his hands. The world blurred around them, the town, the passers-by, the turning leaves. Only he remained. Only this moment. "I waited," she choked out, her voice breaking under the weight of years spent hoping. "I never stopped believing." James lifted a shaking hand to her cheek, wiping away a tear with the tenderness of a man who had lived 1,000 lifetimes just to return to this one embrace. "Neither did I," he said. "Through every step, every mile, every night I thought I wouldn't survive, I held on to you." Eleanor's legs gave way, and James caught her, holding her as tightly as he dared. The strength that had carried him through war, through captivity, through the impossible road home, now held her as if she were the only thing keeping him upright. A hush settled over the town square as people began to notice. Shopkeepers, old neighbors, children who had only heard his name and whispered stories, one by one, they stopped to watch, their breaths held in reverence for a love that had endured time itself. The old oak tree where they had once carved their names stood in the distance, its branches swaying gently, as if nodding in approval. Eleanor pulled back just enough to study his face, to memorize every change, every scar, and yet he was still her James. Her soldier, her love, her promise kept. "Let's go home," she said softly, and for the first time in decades, James knew what home truly meant. He took her hand, and together, they walked toward the life they had been waiting for. The war had taken so much. But it had not taken this. It had not taken them. The end.